Hey scholars, welcome to week 8. This week is going to be a little bit shorter than the usual just because there's stuff in class that we're going through, and it won't all translate over to our online class like school behaviors, dress codes, things like that. So enjoy your short week, and I hope you had a great weekend. We're going to go through this and then we will start back up on Monday with a full workload. All right. So for week 8, we're going to move on and talk about the fall of Troy and the Aeneid. If you remember last week, we talked about the judgment of Paris, which was where Paris, a Trojan, had to make a judgment call between three goddesses. There was Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. There was Juno, the queen of the gods. And then there was Minerva, who is the goddess of wisdom in battle and craftsmanship and things like that. So Paris had to judge which of the three was the most beautiful. He, of course, chose Venus and then had to face some repercussions because of that. But let's jump into this week's lesson. Okay, so when I talk about the fall of Troy, I am, of course, talking about the Trojan War. Some of you may be familiar with this story or this horse you're seeing right here. If you are, great. If not, we're going to talk about it. So the horse, the myth, the legend. First of all, let's talk about a guy named Virgil. Virgil, his Roman name is Publius Vergilius Maro, as you can see on the screen right here. We call him Virgil just for simplicity's sake. I'm sure everybody who does not speak Latin as their main language appreciates that. Virgil was a poet during the time of Caesar Augustus, and he was a very famous poet and was commissioned to write several pieces of poetry that now have now, as we look back on them from our point of view, have become some of the most famous Roman pieces of poetry. We can't really know how famous he was during his time, but we know that he at least had some amount of respect because the Aeneid, which is what we're going to be talking about today, is a piece of poetry that he wrote that became so popular that it was sort of folded into their belief system. So we know he was at least a little bit popular, right? Now, the Aeneid is the English term for this piece of epic poetry that he wrote. If you remember from past social studies classes, you probably talked about epic poetry like the story of Gilgamesh or the Iliad, the Odyssey, things like that. It's essentially a poem, but a very long, extended poem, and it tells a big story with heroes and villains, and they go on quests and things. It's very long and involved. It's like reading a book, except it's poetry, right? So this is opposed to a lot of poetry that we're familiar with, where it's a few lines or maybe even a page. But the Aeneid falls into this category, epic poetry, where it's just this big, huge, epic story. And the Romans and the Greeks at the time, they loved those kinds of stories. It was just, they ate it up. So this particular poem, the Aeneid, follows the story of a Trojan man named Aeneas, and we'll get into who he is in just a second. And the most important thing, though, about this poem is that it links the real Romans. Like I said, Virgil was alive during the time of Caesar Augustus, right? So he was very much a real person living during real times. Nothing about his life is mythological at all. However, it links those real Romans with the mythology that they believed in. And to us today, we might say, well, what's the point of that? Why do they care about that? But if you think about it, most of the religions today are monotheistic. That means we believe in one God. And a lot of these religions believe that there is at least some level of connection between God and the people. A lot of Christianity, for example, believes that God is a father of sorts to everyone's spirits. However, back then, when they had a multitude of gods, and each of these gods sort of had a different thing that they were in charge of, like Neptune being in charge of the ocean and whatever. It's a little bit harder to form this connection, right? But they still craved that. They wanted to be connected to the gods. It made them feel good, made them feel important. And so Virgil, through the Aeneid, uses his storytelling to make a tangible link between the Roman mythology and the Roman daily life, particularly through the Caesars and the emperors. And we will look at that and why that is a little bit later. But anyway, that's important to keep in mind, that for them, the Aeneid served as a bridge between the mythology and the man, so to speak. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to look at the Trojan War, Troy versus Greece. How do I hide my face here? I'm not sure. Anyway, you just won't be able to read that bottom bit. Anyway, so the Trojan War, it's debated about whether it actually really happened. At least in the stories of the Iliad and the Aeneid, to them they felt like it was real. Again, historians aren't really sure. There's evidence to support that it did happen, but it's so long ago, it's really hard to tell. Anyway, according to the mythology, there was a king, the king of Sparta. His name was King Menelaus. And if you remember where we left off last time, where Paris chose Venus as the most beautiful goddess because she promised that he could marry the most beautiful woman in the world, whose name was Helen. And if you remember, I think I introduced her as Helen of Sparta, right? Helen was a Spartan, yes, but she was also a very important Spartan. Helen was the wife of King Menelaus, and she was already married at the time that Paris made this deal. So if you know anything about the Spartans, it's that they love war, right? And if you think that Paris is just going to stroll up and steal away the wife of the king of Sparta without there being any repercussions, you got another thing coming, because that was not going to go unpunished. To them, they viewed Paris as just some Trojan who came and sort of strolled in the palace. They hosted him. Back then, there wasn't any bad blood between the Trojans and the Spartans, and so they hosted this man who was a prince from Troy and whatever, and he ended up kidnapping, according to them, the wife of the king of Sparta. Now, Helen, according to the mythology, didn't feel like she was kidnapped. She did not feel like a victim. She fell in love with Paris fair and square, although she was probably helped along a lot by Venus. But the point is, whether it was a kidnapping or not is just in the eye of the beholder, right? According to King Menelaus, Helen was kidnapped. According to Paris, Helen was not kidnapped. She was just and she loved him, or so she said, and that was just the result of this choice that he made between the goddesses. Anyway, so there was some real hate there, though, because King Menelaus' wife had been kidnapped. Now, his brother, King Agamemnon, was a king of a larger amount of territory, and he had connections with all the other Greek states, the Greek city-states. So he gathered them all together to go sail across the sea to go fight Troy. Now, you might not be able to see it very well on this map here, but if you look, Sparta is down here. I need to make that thing go away. Sparta is down at the bottom, and then there you go. And then Troy is over here in the top right. So Troy's up here. And all of the Greeks, they had to sail across this sea called the Aegean Sea up to Troy. During the Trojan War, a whole lot of people died, including several Greek heroes like Achilles. and several Trojan heroes like Paris. Paris did die during the Trojan War, unfortunately, and King Menelaus was able to take his wife Helen back to his, back to Greece. Why did this happen? This happened because essentially Paris made the other goddesses mad. While the Greeks were attacking Troy, they had the help of Minerva, who the Greeks knew as Athena, right? The Greeks knew her as Athena, and she assisted the Greeks in attacking the city. So they were very successful because she not only is the goddess of wisdom, but she's also the goddess of like battle strategy, right? And Juno, or Hera, as the Greeks knew her as, was also very upset with the Trojans because Paris was a Trojan, and the gods and goddesses just like to lump everybody together into big groups, right? So she was against the Trojans. She helped out the Greeks. There was a lot of death, but ultimately, this entire fight was caused by Paris choosing Venus over the other two. Let's move on. See if it'll. Why is it? It's not going. Okay, there we go. So eventually, though, despite the help of Minerva, despite the help of Juno, the Greeks were not able to get through the walls of Troy. Troy was famous around the world at the time for having the largest walls around the city, this impenetrable defense, right? And the Greeks, even though they had a lot of help from all the other Greek city-states, they weren't able to get through the walls of Troy. And after a long time, they started to lose faith. They started to lose hope. And the Greeks were talking about going home. Now, that would have been a huge knock on their honor, right? If you start a war to rescue a kidnapped queen, it's very honorable, and you're like, yeah, we got to finish this. And then if you start going home without the queen, that makes you look bad. So the Greeks were feeling like they wanted to leave, and Odysseus was a Greek. He was inspired again by Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, or Athena as they called her, to not allow his fellow Greeks to leave, but instead to come up with a plan in order to help them conquer the city. So what they did is they ended up overnight taking away, they took apart their boats. All of the boats. Now, the Greeks had to use the boats to get there, and taking apart the boats means that they couldn't leave. Very inconvenient. But they took apart their boats overnight. And when the Trojans woke up in the morning, they saw that all the boats were gone, which told them that the Greeks had left. What they found instead was a big giant horse at the entrance of their city. And there was an inscription on the horse that said, we couldn't beat you, sorry, you guys won, but here's a gift instead. Take this horse and let's have peace. So you can see kind of in this picture, there's like a bunch of people celebrating. The Trojans, they found this big giant horse sitting outside their city walls, and they brought it inside the city. They had a big celebration. Yay, the Greeks are gone. We beat them. We won the war, all this stuff. Everybody was celebrating and having a good time. You'll notice, though, that the horse is really, really big, right? And so what the Greeks had been doing is after they took apart their ships and they built this horse, they made a trap door and they climbed up inside the horse like a piñata, like a people piñata. Anyway, so all the Greek soldiers that were still alive, which there wasn't even a ton of them left at this point, but there was enough to cause some damage, they all climbed up inside this horse, and then they waited there. And when the Trojans brought it inside, essentially, they brought the Greeks. They invited the Greeks into their city. Everybody was having a party, everybody was having a good time, and eventually they let their guard down. And that night, skipped too early. That night, the Greeks came down out of the trap door that was in the horse, and they came out and they just started causing mass destruction. They started fires. They killed a lot of people. It was crazy. Eventually, Achilles died that night, the Greek hero. Paris died that night, the main character of the story from the previous week. Paris, the guy who made that judgment call, and he became Helen's new husband. He was dead just like that. And for the rest of the Trojans, though, it was time to go. The city was burning down. The Greeks were crazy. They were just killing everybody, and it was, if you weren't able to get out, you were going to die, and that's exactly what happened. But this man, his name is Aeneas. This guy right here with the sort of helmet on, carrying the other person, his name is Aeneas. Aeneas then becomes the protagonist of our story, of the Aeneid. It's named after this guy, right? Now, Aeneas, just like every character in these big epic stories, was not a regular person. He was the son of Venus. So he was a half child, half human, half god child, right? He was a demigod. And because he was Venus's child, and Venus in this story was on the side of the Trojans, right? Because she's the one that helped Paris fall in love with Helen and then take her back to Troy. So she was on the side of the Trojans, and her child Aeneas, she was there at the time, and she inspired him to gather up anybody that she could. She kind of gave him a little bit of a forewarning, some advance notice, and helped him escape with these other people out from the city, and they were able to make it to some boats in time and kind of push off out of the city as it was burning down around them, and they escaped. There's no exact numbers about how many people left with him, but it's estimated somewhere in the hundreds, around there. Anyway, so Aeneas, helped by his mother Venus, escaped from the city. All right, so let's pause there for a second, stop and think about it. If you were to be suddenly forced to leave your hometown, people were there, everything was going crazy, riots, burning, everything, and you only had a few minutes to prepare before things got really crazy, what would you take with you? For some people, it would be some of their material possessions. For some people, it would be their family. For some people, maybe it's something really important to them, like a favorite book or a favorite I don't know, some favorite item. Last year, we talked about Thomas Jefferson, and while Thomas Jefferson's house was burning down, he wasn't there at the time, but his servants gathered up one of his most prized possessions, which was his violin. They saved his violin. So if you were in this situation, you are Aeneas, and you have just a little bit of warning to get out of town before everything gets out of control, what would you take with you? So stop there and think about it. After you've given that some thought, unpause, and let's move on. Okay, hard to see because it's hidden behind my head. I'm sorry. Maybe I can move myself. There we go. Okay, I don't know if that moved it for you too, but we'll see. Meeting Dido. Now this is a big chunk of the story. So Aeneas, along with his family and some of his friends and other co-habiters of the city, co-inhabitants, I guess, I don't know. They push off in their boats and they set sail. They are not having a good time because Juno still is all bent on revenge. At this point, Minerva is mostly placated. The Greeks won the Trojan War, and she feels like that justice was served, sort of thing. However, Juno is just really vengeful, and kind of petty, honestly. But as they're sailing away, she says, "Well, this isn't good. Some of these Trojans made it out alive, so I'm going to, I need to stop them." So she talked to Neptune and attempted to get him to sink their ship. And um, it took Venus kind of swooping in and making a backdoor deal with Neptune. If if you help me out by not sinking the ship, I'll help you out by doing whatever. I don't remember exactly how that part of the myth goes, but it had something to do with some people that were like some of Neptune's children or something, and she was going to help them fall in love. I don't remember. Um, anyway, so they but they don't die there. They go through some terrible tempests and storms, and they don't die there. And a few days later, Juno discovers that they are still alive, and she's furious. So she goes to the gods who control the wind and says, "Okay, I need you to blow their boat into the land and crash them." Right. And this time, Venus takes a more hands-on approach as she approaches Juno directly and says, "Hey, don't don't kill these people. All right, I will make sure that they get to um, somewhere where they can be safe and out of the way. And in exchange, they won't bother you anymore." Juno says, "Okay." So they end up sailing into a city called Carthage. That's Carthage, Carthage. And while they're there, they meet the queen of Carthage. Her name is Dido. Oh, did I not? Thought I had a picture for that. Sorry. Okay, so they meet the queen of Carthage. Her name is Dido. And as usually happens in these kinds of stories, as soon as Dido meets Aeneas, she falls in love with him. Now, Dido was a very successful queen. She was powerful. She was very smart. She had taken the city of Carthage from being basically nothing to being this strong, powerful city on the north coast of Africa. Uh, and so Carthage was west of Egypt a bit, but in Africa, and they were a strong naval power. They did lots of trade. They had very good ships and all that stuff, and it was basically love at first sight. Dido welcomed the Trojans in. She welcomed Aeneas. They made them comfortable, and Dido ended up spending more and more time with him, and they fell in love with each other, and started sort of dating after that. So the fates, however, had more in mind for Aeneas than just sitting there and being happy. Jupiter, who up to this point had been fairly uninvolved in all of this process, was looking down at everybody, and he felt like he needed to nudge Aeneas in a different direction. At some point along the way, someone had made a prophecy that Aeneas would go and found a new civilization, and so he had two options. Well, but actually, I jumped ahead of myself. They had prophesied that Aeneas would found a new civilization, and and Jupiter was big on fulfilling that promise, right? So he sent Mercury down to talk to Aeneas, and he said, "Hey, Aeneas, you really need to stop hanging out in Carthage. You're not fulfilling your destiny. You're kind of just wasting your time here." And so at this point, Aeneas had an option. He had two choices he could make, right? So the one choice was to stay in Carthage or to go. And if he was to stay, as you can see, he would have been married to Queen Dido. I'm pretty sure they were engaged at the time. He would have been happy, and honestly, he was happy there. He was very happy just living in Carthage, doing whatever it was that he was doing on a daily basis with Queen Dido. He would have become the king, So instant kingdom, must be nice. You show up, you marry the queen one day, and suddenly all of the kingdom that she worked hard to build is now yours. And it was a great place for the people to settle down. All of his people were happy there. They had loved it. They were welcomed by everybody else. It was, nice, like fertile territory, lots of crops, lots of trade, money coming through everything. And he would have enjoyed a nice VIP status by just getting recognized everywhere he goes and everything. On the other hand, if he was to go, do what Jupiter says, and to go, he would be fulfilling his destiny. For the Romans, fulfilling your destiny is a huge deal. Although many of them didn't have any sort of like destiny that they were supposed to fulfill or anything, they felt like as a society, as a people, as a country, that they had a very strong destiny to fulfill. So this urge to go and fulfill his destiny is a very real one. It's a very big one. He would have had to settle a new land all on his own without there being an existing country already there. It would have meant years of war and difficulty and lasting enmity, which means basically you don't like each other, between his people and Carthage, because the Carthaginians had welcomed them in, had made everybody feel comfortable, and then it was like, see ya, we're heading out. And that would have been really rude for the Romans to do that, or for the Trojans, excuse me. And Aeneas would have been responsible for some death. And I mean that in a couple ways. The first way is that because of this event, and I'll just spoil it now, he chose to go. He chose to instead of stay, he chose to go and fulfill his destiny. So Aeneas left. He up and left. He didn't even take the time to discuss it with Dido before leaving. He felt like he needed to just cut ties, and so he packed up his people, and the next day they were gone. Now, what do I mean by this responsible for death bit? So because of this, the Carthaginians and the Trojans, who later became the Romans, they disliked each other very heavily. The Carthaginians felt like they had been offended because the Trojans came and they ate their food and they got welcomed in and everything, and then one day they just left. And because of that, there ended up being three separate wars between Carthage and Rome. I mean, it was a huge deal. These were called the Punic Wars, and we'll talk about those more when we get to next quarter. But it ended up being a huge deal, so lots and lots of death. And then in addition, when they left, Queen Dido was so heartbroken that she actually killed herself. And it's very dramatic in the story, and I'm sure a real person would not have done that. Although Queen Dido was real, but I'm sure it's made more dramatic for the fact that it's kind of a mythological story, right? But because of that, this all started this just downward spiral of things not going well for them. So anyway, though, after a long, hard journey and several more stops, Aeneas, having left Troy, sailed across the sea to Carthage, sailed across more sea, finally landed in a place called Latium. Latium was a territory that they had never seen before. There were people living there. There were some cities and stuff, but nothing super, super strong. Latium was the name that the locals called that area, and that's actually where we get the name of the word Latin, right? It comes from Latium, where the people came from, and it's also what the people were called, the Latin people. So despite the fact that he was fulfilling his destiny, not everything there was awesome. There was a series of wars with the locals in which a lot of people died. His dad died along the way. Most of these wars were brought on by Juno, who was still jealous about the whole apple thing. She did not let that go for a long time. Eventually, though, Aeneas and his people were able to settle down in Latium and make a name for themselves. And I believe that's where we stopped today. They settled down in a city. After some generations, um, the city of Rome finally sprang up, and we will talk about that in the next lesson next week. Anyway, I hope you have a fantastic week. I hope that everything is well for all of you. If you have any questions or anything, please let me know. I will talk to you all later.